Hello, this is Kirk. Welcome to On Purpose. We're unpacking the pathway to building purpose and meaning in your life. And by now you can tell that we've started with the idea that we are all living inside of stories. Episode 1, we talked about how you have a dual position in your own story, that of a character and an author. And in order to create meaning and purpose in your life, we want to hold the position of author. In episode 2, we talked about how it is only the author who can name the story that we're living in. And that's important because the things we name, we have power over, and the things that name us have power over us. We learned that there are 3 kinds of stories that we're living. Stories that are awesome, stories that used to be awesome, and stories that never were. Knowing the difference is critical because some stories need to be told over and over and over, and some need to be rewritten entirely. Today we're going to take the next step and begin to talk about why stories form and why they're hard to rewrite. And the answer is quite simple. Stories have gravity. What is gravity? We used to think gravity was a force. But then we learned that gravity, in fact, is the bending of the fabric of space and time. That's a metaphor. Space and time are not fabric. But in understanding the metaphor, we can understand a bit about how gravity works. I'll put a link in the show notes to some videos that walk you through this metaphor. But simply said, space-time is like fabric. If you were to stretch a piece of fabric out and then drop a bowling ball into it, it would bend the fabric, creating a gravity well. And then if you were to drop a marble onto that fabric, the marble would fall into the bowling ball. The greater the mass, the greater the gravity. Our minds are a universe unto themselves. And in the same way, there is a fabric of our mind. Stories are like the bowling ball. Very young, we come to conclusions about how the world works. Circumstances happen to us, and we decide the world is not safe. We decide I'm amazing. We decide that I'm worthy of love and acceptance. We decide that I'm not. We decide all kinds of things. And these become the stories of our life. All of us have an origin story. The place and time when we were born came into existence, and it forms us. These stories are told over and over and over. And in doing so, the story generates gravity in our mind, in our mental universe, in our understanding of how the world works. The repetitive telling of a story adds gravity to it, creating a bowling ball in our fabric of our mind. And then, circumstances, little marbles, fall into our mind. They land inside of the fabric of our mind and they fall into the bowling ball, the story that we've told over and over and over. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that there's a boy who is beaten by his father, abused in some way, physically and otherwise, by his father from the time he's, say, 6 until he's 15. And his father reminds him, "You're worthless." Well, that forms a story. It's sourced in these events. It's sourced in the words of the father. However, the child begins to tell the story himself. The child begins to say, "I'm not worth anything." Well, the abuse continues until he's 15, at which point he's able to get out of the house. But he's carrying this bowling ball story in his life that says you're not worth anything. Now, circumstances along the way are going to be oriented by that story. So let's say somewhere a few years later, he ends up getting married. And his new wife says to him, "I love you." That's a marble. And the marble falls into the gravity well of this story that has been told over and over and over. And now the marble gets oriented by the story. So the words "I love you" land in this young man's heart as, "Well, yeah, I know you said that, but if you knew the real me, you wouldn't say that." Or he might conclude, "Yeah, I know you said that, but you have to say that because I kind of tricked you into marrying me." And he's unable to receive the love of his wife. The gravity of this story overwhelms the words "I love you" and turns them into something other than what his wife meant. That is not a helpful story. So how do you untell a story? Well, I would suggest that you don't. You find a new one. You find a new story to tell, and you understand that telling that story over and over and over creates gravity in your mind. And when you stop telling the old story, it begins to degravitate. It doesn't have as much power over you as this new story forms. But see, here's the thing. A character can't do that work. Characters are trapped within the gravity of the story that defines them. But an author can defy gravity. An author can hear the old story beginning to form in their mind. An author can hear that tape running, can see the results of that story, how it makes them feel and what they do, and can go, wait a minute, that's not helpful. That's an old story that I am not bound by. And they can begin to write a new one. They can tell a different story and give it gravity. And in doing so, they aren't untelling the old story. They're just not telling it. They're not maintaining the gravity that it has in their life. And yes, this is hard work. This takes time. There is no easy path where an old story can be popped like a balloon and just disintegrate in front of you and not have power over you. It'll rear its head again. The circumstances of life will begin to be oriented by it, and you'll feel it, but you'll get better and better at recognizing, wait a minute, this is the old story. Get back into author and tell the new one. Now, in the beginning of this work, it'll feel like the old story is a fact, that it's just true, that it's been vetted and tested over and over again. And it'll feel like the new story is coming straight out of some fairy tale, some fantasy, some fiction. And they compete with each other as though one is nonfiction and one is fiction. But I'm here to tell you they're both just meaning. They're the meaning that we're attaching to facts. Neither one of them is true in the sense of factual. And the question is it helpful? Is it advancing you in connection and relationship with others? Is it helping you be increasingly trustworthy? Is it moving you toward your goals? Is it helpful? And if it's not, change the story, rewrite it. And yes, it's super hard. It's just not complicated. Now, a brief aside. There are a number of things in our life that affect our ability to experience transformation. The stories that we tell is just one of them. But sometimes we run into other things. Trauma, for instance. Events that took place in our life that are so debilitating we can't even access the stories that they're formed. And this practice of rewriting your story may not be enough. It certainly may not be something you can do on your own. And there are wonderful counselors and therapists and psychologists that have been expertly trained. And of course, there's a few that aren't so good at the work. Avoid them like you avoid a bad mechanic. Doesn't mean mechanics aren't awesome. But so many of the things that keep us from accomplishing our goals are within our grasp. You just have to recognize that's a story I'm telling that's unhelpful, but I've told it for a long time, giving it gravity. And then get yourself in the position of author who can defy gravity and fly into a new story and tell it until it carries the gravity in your life that you want and can shape the events of your life. Because remember, some stories that we carry are awesome. Some stories used to be, and some never were. So maintain the position of author. Notice the stories you're telling. Notice without judgment. Just notice. Don't critique yourself. And when you find the stories, name them. And as you name them, begin to ask yourself, is that story helpful? And if they're not, work to rewrite them. Because authors can defy gravity. In fact, I think they can fly. If you'd like to reach out and get a hold of me, you can do that at kirkwayman.com. That's where I have blogs and links to other podcast projects that I'm working on, or you can go to iconcoaching.com. That's IKON coaching.com. This is the home of my work as an executive coach. And of course, you can find us on Facebook by searching On Purpose with Kirk Wayman. I'd welcome your thoughts and feedback or questions about the show. But more than anything, I'd like to hear your stories about how you're living a life on purpose.